It's Conduit News Radio with Paul Harrell.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the program. We really appreciate you being with us this morning. Got a special treat for you. Please welcome to the program for the first time. We have conservative author, historian, his Mr. Jay Cost is on the line. Jay, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Yes, my audience is going to know who you are just because I've referenced your book several times on the air over the last couple of years. One of my favorites, it's called A Republic No More, Big Government and the Rise of American Political Corruption. I'm going to show it to him on the screen here, Jay. I especially love the very beginning where we talk about legal graft. We cover a lot of that on the program about how when the government does something, it's somehow legal, but if you and I were to do it, it might be illegal or unethical. Just talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, usually when we think about corruption, we think of money in a brown paper bag, or we think maybe about Abscam. I don't know if any of your listeners remember Abscam from the early 80s. It's shakedown by the government dressed as Arab sheiks. That's usually what we think about. But I think that we should understand corruption more broadly. Is really anytime corruption happens when the government plays favorites in a way that doesn't benefit the whole country. And I think, in the course of researching and writing The Republic No More, one of the things that I found was that the government tends to play favorites with people who are wealthy and well-connected. I mean, nowadays we associate, well, if you want to help the poor, you're in favor of big government. But I think that big government just as often helps the wealthy and the well-connected who are able to basically use their political power to line their own pockets, really at the expense of the taxpayers.
That's exactly right. And matter of fact, I've got on your Twitter, I'm going to pull that up here. We're talking with Jay Cost. He is a conservative author, historian. You've also probably read about him, the National Review. The Price of Greatness. This is another book. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and the Creation of the American Oligarchy. So this wealthy class that can benefit from big government, is that kind of the American oligarchy that you write about in The Price of Greatness?
Yes, the book is sort of an early history of the rise of the wealthy and their role in public policy. Oligarchy is basically derived from the Greek, basically means the rule of the rich. And that book is about how Hamilton wanted to rechannel the self-interest of the wealthy for the sake of the national good, which was a very smart plan. I mean, the book isn't pro-Hamilton or anti-Hamilton or pro-Madison, anti-Madison. Hamilton had a really brilliant idea about recognizing that the wealthy were going to make a bet on the future of the United States, and he wanted to make sure public policy was designed in a way that that the wealthy would bet on their success. But Madison observed this problem, which was that when we bring the wealthy into, we want to make it, yoke the interests of the wealthy toward the public good. It's actually a two-way street. One of the problems that happened in the early days of our government was public policy got retooled in important ways to benefit the wealthy. And this is actually what brought about the first political parties that we had in our country between the Federalists and the Republicans.
So to kind of conceptualize this, when we hear the phrase now of draining the swamp, and, there does seem to be, predictably so, an allergy to doing this, I guess, to say it lightly, where people don't, they don't want the gravy train of government. There's a lot of money to be made off of a big government. Do you see that shifting at all in what we've seen President Trump attempt to do, or even some of the things that he's done? There's this giant pushback against what he's trying to do.
Yeah, it's hard to do. I haven't seen any real movement. And I think, it's important to bear in mind that the status quo in Washington, if we say it's corrupt, which I think it is, it nevertheless benefits lots and lots of people, and they're not going to let things change willingly. It requires constant effort from voters and constant pressure. Voters to demand that Washington behave more responsibly. And that is something that I don't think we really see. Where, we usually think of political corruption as this separate issue from like health care or taxes or, energy policy. But I think that political corruption is a problem that informs all of our other public policy problems. And in a lot of respects, I think it's almost the first problem in government. And I think that as long as we continue to see corruption as a separate issue, it's always going to be, first of all, corruption is always going to hang around. Question is whether or not it's become intolerable. I think it has. I think the challenge is that voters don't prioritize it as an issue. Unfortunately, you saw this in New Jersey last night, right? Bob Menendez was censured by the Senate for basically being corrupt. And he won re-election easily last night. It just sends a message to everybody in Washington, D.C. that, hey, you can get away with this stuff.
Yeah, and it's very, very discouraging. And I noticed, when you said that corruption will always be around, and then that's part of the human condition, right? And I think that's why our founding fathers, they counted on the fallibility of man, and that's why they created the Constitution to put limits on those with the power. But if corruption is something that is always going to be around, to me, that would then necessitate a limited government. It would necessitate trying to make sure that the government stays as small and confined in its role as possible. What are your thoughts?
I completely agree. The larger the government, the more opportunities there are for corruption. The more capacity the government has to make winners and losers, which is really what we're talking about. The larger the government gets, the more money that it has control over, the more it can make or destroy fortunes, right? So that's going to create more incentives for people to lobby the government to make sure that they make them rich or keep them from the poorhouse, right? This is just the danger of an expansive government. One of the most corrupt governments in the 20th century was the Soviet Union, which is a totalitarian government.
Can I get we're talking with Jay Cost, who's a conservative author. He's a historian. From a historian standpoint, last night, the midterm elections, were you surprised at all at the outcomes?
I was a little surprised. I did not expect the Republicans to do as well as they did in the Senate. From the looks of it right now, the Republicans are going to pick up a net of 3 seats, which is more than pretty much all the major race handicappers had estimated. Their losses in the House were about in line with historical projections. So I think that it wasn't a slam dunk for Democrats, which, a lot of people were expecting. I think that as midterms go, it was pretty middle of the road, which I think maybe was a surprise because I think people were sort of expecting a major rebuke to President Trump, and I don't think that we saw that last night. Florida is the quintessential swing state, and here it voted out a Democrat senator and elected another Republican governor.
Yeah,
it's hard to see that as a rebuke. So I think that it's and also I would add that we're back to divided government, which has been the norm in American history since the end of World War II. Really, most of the time since Harry Truman left office in 1952 has been spent with the two parties sharing power one way or the other.
Yeah, that is true, and I agree with what you're saying about the not having some sort of mandate here, where President Trump or what the Republicans have been doing has been rejected. I think there's a lot of people out there, Republican voters, they turned out just because of the results. You have the Supreme Court, for example. I think the Brett Kavanaugh hearings really motivated the right. That seems to be kind of the consensus. Would you agree with that?
I would. I think that probably gave a spur to, especially in the redder states, Missouri, North Dakota, Indiana, Montana, which the Democrats nearly lost and was really a sleeper race. I think that Republicans are probably kicking themselves for not investing more in Montana. But all of those states had Democrat senators who voted against Kavanaugh, and all of them lost or very narrowly lost in Florida too. But West Virginia, which is now one of the most pro-Trump, actually I would say West Virginia is the most pro-Trump state in the country, reelected their Democratic senator, Joe Manchin, who also, not coincidentally, I think, was the only Democrat to vote for Kavanaugh. So it's pretty strong evidence, circumstantial, but it's pretty strong evidence that made a difference last night.
So last week we have a whiteboard in the studio, and I put some slogan on it once a week. And last week it was just "If you can keep it," and it was obviously referencing what you've written about Benjamin Franklin's response to the question. You know, what did you give us? And a republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. Back to the book that I really enjoy about corruption. And by the way, A Republic No More, I especially love the fact of the illustration on the front. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but this illustration, wasn't this like a piece of campaign rhetoric when we were trying to abolish the state legislature from electing senators and instead move to the popular vote?
Yeah, that's actually, it's from Puck Magazine in 1905, and it's sort of a criticism of the machine style of politics that had really become very pronounced in the North. And so
as I look at this, Jay, I just think to myself, I mean, it really, if you didn't know the era it was from, it would still fit in right now. It fits in perfectly.
Yeah, I agree. That's why I picked it as my. I was looking around at, when I was getting the book ready, and I was looking around for uncopyrighted historical photographs. I couldn't believe my good fortune for finding something that fits the thesis of the book so perfectly.
That's great. Right here, just in the fold, this book argues we couldn't, meaning we couldn't keep the republic. Just talk briefly a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think ultimately the problem is that we have a government that was designed to exercise limited powers. And that was the design of it. When you think about the structure of the Senate, the structure of the House, the presidency, right, it was designed to handle certain enumerated powers, right? But now we have a government that, in effect, can do anything that it wants. But it wasn't designed to do that. It wasn't designed to handle unlimited power. And the argument of my book is that the structure of our government does not fit. It's not a good fit for the powers it wields. I mean, it's almost like, imagine building, like if you're going to build a house, you're going to dig a foundation for your house, for a 2-story house. But you wouldn't add, 10 more stories on a building that his house is only built for 2 stories, the foundation is. Sort of the same thing with our government. Our government was originally designed to handle a small amount of power. We just kept adding power upon power upon power to it, and it doesn't handle it responsibly. And so we don't have a republic, right, which, as Lincoln said, is the government that's supposed to be of the people, by the people, for the people. We have something that's closer to what in the book I call an interest group democracy, where it's really a matter of groups grasping for whatever spoils they can get from the government.
Let me ask you this, is kind of our last question here. Do you think you mentioned earlier that you don't really see any huge movements when it comes to draining the swamp? Do you think that's because maybe some of the substance that President Trump is attempting to do isn't happening, or do you think the system resists it because of his style? Potentially, that you hear a lot of people say, well, really like what's happening, but yeah, sometimes I don't always agree with the approach or that sort of thing. What are your thoughts about what's going on right now?
I think that the real problem is, frankly, President Trump's "drain the swamp" is a great line, but where's the policy that he's put behind it? And when did he put forward some genuine reform effort to clean out the influence of interest groups? What's the legislation? I didn't see anything like that, and he didn't stake it. Presidents, when they get elected, they can only really get a couple things done. So this is what I'm doing. I'm going all in on this, right? George Bush did tax cuts, and Obama did Obamacare. Trump decided to do tax cuts. He didn't push all in on, let's drain the swamp. And I think that that's really kind of been the problem, which is, and frankly, A lot of presidents do the same thing. They campaign against Washington, but then they get there, and then what policies are they proposing that are going to fix Washington? What's the legislation that he's introduced in Congress? I haven't seen anything. I think that's the real problem, to be honest. His rhetorical style is what it is. It's worked for him. It was a problem for House Republicans last night, but not for Senate Republicans.
True.
But I'm just trying to think, where has he actually said, okay, here is my Drain the Swamp Act of 2018? What was it? I haven't seen anything.
So what's the hatred? Where's the hatred coming from then? What is he doing to provoke the hatred?
Well, look, I think Trump is making manifest certain cultural divisions that exist in our subtext, in our cultural subtext. And I think bottom line, when you get right down to it, the people who hate Trump look at him and think this is not the type of guy who should be in charge. The type of guy who should be in charge is one of our guys. I think it's really as simple as that when you get right down to it. That a guy like Trump is just not the type of guy who's supposed to be in charge of the country. It's supposed to be a guy like Obama or a guy like Romney or a guy like Bush, right? He's the wrong type. Almost. Trump plays political hardball, but I think Obama played political hardball too. But Obama just phrased his hardballs. He just phrased it in a way that appealed to the people that Trump that they just hate Trump. Like Obama said, substance of not a lot of what Obama said was very similar to the substance of what Trump is saying. Like the sort of stuff Obama would say about Fox News, Trump says about CNN. From a substantive perspective.
Yeah.
But Trump says it in a way that just upsets these people, and it upsets the editorial page of the New York Times.
Yeah.
I think that's really what it is. I think the editorial page of the New York Times thinks that a guy like Donald Trump has no business being president.
I think I definitely agree with you there, Jay Cost. And it's been a privilege to get to interview you, sir. I love your writings. I love your book. And hopefully we can do it again sometime. And really appreciate you coming on this morning.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me. This was a great interview. I appreciate your time.
All righty. Jay Cost, everybody.